for having me. I'm absolutely delighted. Well, let me sit down maybe. Well, I can contain myself. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce to you an all-star panel. You know, these are people, analysts that I look to when I want to learn something. You know, we have Michael Thelander. He's the founder and CEO of Mobile Signals Research Group. Jennifer Fritzsche, who is, Michael will give us a technological angle here in the discussion. Jennifer Fritzsche with Wells Fargo, wonderful, excellent investment analyst who will give us the investment angle, and Berge Ayvazian, who is an expert in the mobile market space and competition, and a very dear ex-colleague of mine from the old days at the Yankee Group, and myself, Roger Entner, I'm with Recon Analytics. So if we look at the US market today, you know, how do you view the competitive landscape? And maybe I'll start with Jennifer.
Sure. Thank you for having me, Roger. Just to put in perspective, I follow all the public stocks of the big four wireless carriers, as well as many of the fiber companies and RLX and tower companies and whatnot. But as we look at the competitive landscape in wireless, there is this real concern of this price war going on since T-Mobile got the iPhone in April of 2013, and Sprint kind of sitting itself up and dusting themselves off and coming in with an aggressive plan. The fear is that AT&T and Verizon are just kind of melting ice cubes here, and that it's going to be very hard for them, or the easy days and cherry picking are over since the two smaller competitors have woken up. We don't really agree with the fact that there's a price war. If you look at kind of really between under the hood of what's gone on, I think it's a lot of kind of smoke and mirrors here, because you have had with its EIP plans, these equipment installment plans, really the revenue shifting from one bucket to the other, and that being service to the equipment. And T-Mobile really led that charge, and others followed. And you know, you've seen actually some price increases that I think have gone unnoticed by investors. T-Mobile raised their unlimited price, and then just yesterday took off their $4 for $100 for 10 gigabits rather. Now they're doing that same price point for 4 gigabits. So it's an evolving marketplace, but one I still think that you know, even though we're well over 100% penetration, I think, you know, I believe AT&T and Verizon when they talk about the runway for tablets and other connected devices being much longer than people appreciate.
What do you think, Berge?
So I'd like to put the context of competition in the U.S. market in a bit broader terms. Competition is not merely between mobile operators. Competition is really from the user's perspective, what are my options for doing what I want to do? And certainly in this room, most of you are using Wi-Fi. Am I correct? What are you guys using here? Because you're all doing stuff. So what are you doing? How are you connected? LTE, okay. So perhaps that trade-off, given unlimited or given the coverage and penetration in this building, which probably a year ago wasn't there. But my point, though, is that we do have a competitive environment in the sense of choices that users have in terms of what their connectivity is and how they gain access to content and services. I think the other new development, I think Jennifer hit right on it, is BYOD. And now we're in an era where we're starting to move toward having users define the relationship they have with service providers. The new iPhones, the new iPads, for the first time have a removable SIM card. So they can be moved from one operator to the other very easily. And we're going to start to see how that change starts to find its way into smartphones. When we are in an environment where I can buy a generic iPhone or a generic Android device, and I can move from carrier to carrier very easily, and it's my device. It's BYOD. I paid for it. I brought it to the marketplace. That's going to change the competitive environment. And we're already at a point now where you can't compete unless you're one of the big four. And perhaps if you're the third and fourth, you can't compete either. But you're going to be an upstart. You're going to be a disruptor. You're going to try and change the rules of the game. Or if you're America Mobile and you've created a whole new paradigm where you don't own a network at all, and as an MVNO, you've got 15 brands and all different plans and options, and a lot of people now choose your service. So I think the competitive environment has to be thought of differently. I think Comcast is in it. I think clearly we're going to start seeing new ways of people connecting. And I also think we need to imagine 5G in the context of something broader than just the dominant mobile operators who already today control the wireless industry.
But even if we look at just wireless, you know, the fourth largest carrier, T-Mobile, is growing leaps and bounds. You know, they're the fastest growing one. So to say that number 3 and 4 can't really compete speaks contrary to the numbers. Absolutely. And you know, you have really an intense amount of competition in the market, you know, with consumers rapidly shifting their allegiances from one operator, you know, that was dead or played dead, you know, we don't know, to the one that's leading the charge with some new leadership and new innovation. And
some money from AT&T and some spectrum as well. So I think clearly, you know, the revival of T-Mobile USA has been the result of a failed merger, and perhaps two. The second one was even more interesting, and now we'll see whether this is sustainable. This is either a blip, disruptive blip, short term, or whether it's something that is sustainable in terms of long-term competition.
So when we look at the effects of that competition, you know, Jennifer, you wrote about that you have concerns that the capital investment might not be sustainable. What can you articulate a little bit of that
Sure.
to our audience?
Well, I mean, I think that you know, this is a very highly intensive capital industry. I mean, just to throw some numbers, AT&T is spending $21 billion this year. That includes their wireline segment, and Verizon $16 to $17 billion. And what I think the point I was making is you need to see some returns off of that. And it's going to be difficult to see that, I mean, without the scale that T-Mobile and Sprint, frankly, lack right now. So right now they're in a period of capital investment, but I think T-Mobile actually, I think my point was that is probably going to have to spend more to be able to accommodate this growth they're seeing, because it's not just subscribers that are under using the network. I mean, they've talked about publicly that their iconic smartphone users, so think Galaxy, think iPhone, are using about 4.5 gigs per month. And frankly, I think those are customers, I mean, people in the audience could speak to that more than me, that AT&T and Verizon are happy to see leave, because that is just a huge number, and one that I think you're going to have to spend. I'm not convinced that they've in any way spent ahead of that demand.
So, you know, Michael, what can operators do to address this this need for more usage, for that we also see what can the regulatory environment do to help in this place to make it better and more predictable to invest, and how can we solve this conundrum?
Sure. So we did a study last year, and we looked at kind of, you take the growth curve of mobile data. We took the Cisco forecast, which a lot of people have referred to as kind of their projections and how mobile data will grow in the U.S. And we looked at the two top operators, kind of overlaid their spectrum. We assumed they got more spectrum over the coming years. We assumed they advanced their technologies, keeping in line with the LTE advanced standard. And basically what happens starting sometime next year, depends on the operator, depends on the market, they start to run out of spectrum. They start to run out of capacity. And by 2020, despite new spectrum coming on board, despite advancements in the technology, something like 85% of all of the mobile data traffic has to be offloaded onto something besides the macro network. And that's separate from all the Wi-Fi usage, which is being tracked separately. And so what it really comes down to, probably the biggest, obviously more spectrum is always important and operators never have enough. One of the biggest capacity gains you can get out of your network is a small cell. And I'm sure Andy's going to like this comment, but by and large, if you can think of a small cell, you put a small cell in this room right here, and let's say we're all on AT&T, or maybe the small cell supports all of the operators. Now all of a sudden, all of our traffic is going to that small cell instead of the outdoor macro cell site. And if you're in here right now downloading your email or doing something, you're consuming a disproportionate amount of network resources. You got to penetrate several walls and then travel a kilometer or so to get to the cell site. That's really very inefficient use of network resources. Putting the cell site as close as possible to the consumer is the best way to increase spectral efficiency. It's the best way to improve the user experience, and that's what we're going to need to see that in the coming years. The problem from a regulatory perspective, and this is probably more so in terms of local government than it is federal government, although I think federal government could be involved here as well, it's very difficult for operators to deploy sites. Small sites, large sites, you name it. I was talking with one of the big operators, and they were trying to deploy, basically drop an antenna on a building out in Northern California. It took them a year and a half going through paperwork trying to get this cell site deployed. This was not a big tower. This was just a site on a building. You probably would have noticed the cell site. It took them a year and a half. They finally gave up. The local building owner went to the city, filed a permit. They got a permit that day. So I think there needs to be something done. Obviously, nobody wants a big cell tower in their backyard. But if people really care about capacity, they care about network performance, there really needs to be something done that really allows operators to deploy small cell sites in a very aggressive manner, because that's really the only way you're going to solve the capacity crunch that's coming.
So basically then the news of the lawsuit holding up the 600 megahertz auction is really bad news.
Yes, but I guess you got to keep in mind too, even if the spectrum was available today, you have to clear it. It's going to take several years to basically build it into the LTE standard. You need products out there. So that's not going to happen overnight anyway. We're going to have a capacity crunch before then. So yes, obviously delaying the auction to next year or the following year, that pushes us back further. But even with that spectrum, and we actually modeled that spectrum in our capacity planning model, it doesn't solve the capacity crunch. It just delays the inevitable.
So since we're here in Washington, what can the people here both on the Hill and with the agencies do to help with that?
So I think what's going on right now is not only an effort to look forward at the requirements 5 to 10 years from now, but to imagine what the roadmap is between now and then that will allow us to continue to unfold these industries going forward. But I think the challenge we have is something that we heard a little bit about from Docomo, which is that if you assume a linear progression from where we are and assume that there are no breakthroughs or large disruptive changes in the path you're on, then there really is nothing more than continual enhancement of the environment we're in today. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with having both backward compatibility, which preserves the economic interests of the past and even the users. But at the same time, you have to expect and envision what those disruptors will be that will change that trajectory. And when you think about changing that trajectory, it's not merely, I need more. It's, I can use things other than the spectrum that is in scarce supply and is costing more and more money to do some of the things that I'm trying to accomplish. So as a small example, AT&T's trying to merge with DirecTV at the same time as we're moving through all this evolution on the mobile side. Well, today, satellite television if you were to combine direct and dish, is one of the largest distributors of pay television. And in fact, it's inherently wireless, right? It's another way to deliver programming. You can imagine that if you're going to go through the trouble of acquiring DirecTV, you wouldn't just do it as a bolt-on separate company, but you would re-architect content delivery. You would find a way to triangulate satellite, terrestrial, and mobile into a common system that takes advantage of the coverage of satellite, the fast downstream speed of satellite, the content that's being put up to that satellite, as well as a distributed network that's terrestrial, that then is mobile. How do you create this new method that has a combination of these technologies and doesn't merely put the stress on the terrestrial wireless interface and on the cellular network as the only means of delivering that content? And in fact, if they don't invent it, somebody else will, and they'll go over the top. Somebody will come along, whoever it happens to be, Netflix or otherwise, and says, I have this combination of resources, let's figure out how to do that. And then if you add that last layer, which is the user, the customer, if I'm willing to bring my own device, I'm also willing to bring my own broadband. So between BYOD and BYOD, I'm co-investing in this network. Yes, it is capital intensive, but if you have 100 million subscribers contributing to that investment through their own broadband and through their own devices, that distributes the economics quite a bit and changes the chemistry of what 5G has to be.
You know, you're talking about a very dynamic place where every participant is not only allowed but also required to evolve their business model. You know, we have here some of the hottest topics are around net neutrality, which basically prevents some of the players to evolve their business model. What would be the impact on competition and on the markets if you allow some competitors and market participants to evolve their business models and others are not allowed to? Jennifer,
So, just so I'm clear on the question, if wireless net neutrality was put in effect?
for example.
Yes, I mean, I think that would be very negative for the market. You know, these business models and capital plans and spectrum purchases were all built with the idea that that layer of regulation would not be in place. I think that AT&T and Verizon have probably accepted the reality of what's to come on the wireline network, but on the wireless side, and I know Carolyn and I have had this argument, it doesn't really hold up that they can say we've spent billions of dollars. I understand that, but I think for investors, the game rules would have changed significantly, and therefore investment theses will have changed significantly. So it's hard to see how that would be anything but a significant negative for the group.
What impact would be on the networks?
Oh, they'd crash and burn. That's it. You know, and there's no way. I mean, I guess I'll look at it two different ways. I mean, on the one side, when you talk about wireless today, and maybe outside of North America, maybe Asia, Korea, for example, to some extent, the bottleneck becomes the wireline network, and the speed of light and all those things, and looking at lower latency. But in the U.S. market, it's completely different. And if you try to push all that data, there's only so much spectrum out there. I already said we're going to run out of capacity starting next year in certain markets with certain operators. Now, all of a sudden, you throw this on there and you say net neutrality, the networks will crash. Nobody's going to like anybody as far as their operator. Trying to do differentiated services, they'll take voice over LTE, where you have to give it certain priority traffic. If they say, well, you can't do that, now all of a sudden you can't place a phone call, because my phone call is now being treated no more differentiated than you downloading your email. And so you're going to get just equal priority to me. You're going to disrupt my call. I mean, that's going to be very problematic. And so I think definitely, when they think about net neutrality, you have to treat the wireless networks differently than the wireline. And I think right now, the operators really need to know what the policy is. I was talking with one of the operators, and they said, well, we thought we were complying, but now we just don't know, because the policy really hasn't been fully explained.
I was on a panel yesterday, and one of the participants was working for a medical startup. And the scenario of somebody's heart monitor having the same priority as somebody's YouTube video or Skype chat was frightening, and inhibiting or almost freezing investment. What are some of the other unintended
I think the dilemma
consequences?
you're posing, and I think all of these scenarios are posing, is whether there's a government policy that can protect all this, whether there's an economic structure that can incentivize operators to invest sufficiently and to prioritize traffic appropriately, et cetera. And then third, whether the user has any role in it at all. And really, that's the part that I think everyone's not factoring in. If I want to be able to watch Netflix on my mobile, it's up to me to decide what service to subscribe to, what capacity to sign up for, and which operator to choose. It's really my choice. And it isn't up to that operator to decide whether to prioritize heart monitors, phone calls, and movies. It's up to me to decide what services I want and what I want to pay for. And if I happen to have a heart monitor, and I think it's extremely important that the monitoring of my heartbeat is prioritized as traffic, I should be able to pay for that, or some insurance that I have should be able to pay for that, so that, in fact, it's treated as the highest priority. Otherwise, how will we know what's important or not, or what needs to be prioritized or doesn't? You know, Michael's concern is his phone call. I could care less about his phone call. My email is much more important than his phone call. And I've been waiting for this email. I've been trying to get it here, and he's sitting here hogging up the phone lines. I mean, hang up, Michael.
Yeah. That would mean we would have some protected lanes. And some people are using the word fast lanes almost as a dirty word. But there is a virtue in that.
There's nothing wrong with the concept of fast lanes. The question is whether it's a bilateral relationship between the content provider and the operator, or whether it's a trilateral relationship between the user, the content provider, and the operator. And in my view, I have an economic influence over the speed at which, or the quality of which I'm watching whatever I'm watching, or whatever I happen to be doing. And the user should have a role in determining what that economic equation looks like. It's not just between OTTs and operators. And there's really no need for that to be perceived as completely divergent interests. Because in fact, there's a tremendous overlap between the distributors of content and the suppliers of that content. They have a lot of common interest, and in fact, in many cases, they're the same company. And they don't need to necessarily be at war or at odds. What leads to them being at war is if somebody decides they're the gatekeeper and the other guys are all trying to overcome the gatekeeper. And if you take down that function and you say, okay, look, let's work out a marketplace here. Everybody knows there's trade-offs to be made. Everybody knows there's needs to be a way to do business. And then you add the third layer, which is the end user, into the story and say, okay, well, what should be reasonable for them to pay? Then you can start unraveling this unfortunate bifurcation of what net neutrality means. Net neutrality is just not, you know, Netflix versus AT&T. That's not what it's about.
I just was going to make the point that you touched on it, you know, we call it the double I, investment and innovation. It would be more difficult for, you know, I mentioned the CapEx of AT&T, that AT&T is the largest company in the U.S. or spends the most capital of any U.S. company, and guess who's right behind them? So if that changes, that the investment in innovation, which I know is probably very important to the Obama administration, it creates a lot of jobs, really changes.
And the innovation that comes from this very vibrant ecosphere
That's right.
will diminish. And for more and more companies, mobile is becoming the centerpiece of their strategy for growth. You know, what's the relationship between them? You know, and it's a wide range of companies. It starts with Yahoo that has made the hope for revival hinge on mobile, to Google, to Microsoft, to you name it. I think the entire tech industry is now a mobile industry. You know, what's the relationship between them all and the operators? Yeah.
Okay. Just one of the observations I've had with, you know, the stocks are really just, AT&T and Verizon have just been very weak, as has Sprint. T-Mobile's been the exception. But really the premise is there's no more growth in wireless, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we have to notice, to Roger's point, that a lot of these non-traditional telecom companies are talking about mobile as their future. And I don't want to offend Google or anyone, but it would be very difficult for Google to get into the wireless industry in a big way, putting aside Wi-Fi, but on a national basis without touching one of these 4 carriers. Because we all know, and this has been a consistent theme, that spectrum is certainly a finite asset and a scarce asset. So even if we were to assume, you know, a Google, Yahoo, pick your company, bought all the spectrum in the next 2 auctions, they won't. You know, they would still have less spectrum than T-Mobile. So it's very easy to say, hard to do, and I think people are forgetting that there is this spectrum. There's an extremely high barrier to entry here, and you know, you have to touch one of these carriers to get it. To your point, Marissa Meyer, just because I just was looking at my notes, just said on her call last week, you know, they'll have 1.2 billion in mobile revenue this year. That's double last year. These are still low numbers, but eventually she expects half of Yahoo's revenue to be mobile. Half of their users right now are mobile users. You know, they're essentially becoming a mobile company. Google clearly talks about wireless. So to your point, Roger, you do have this tech companies talking about wireless as their future, and I think people are forgetting that they really need to deal with one of the 4 companies to get there.
Yeah. So, you know, Mike, you know, where are we actually today in the United States in respect to mobile broadband, you know, versus the capabilities that exist?
Sure. So one of the things that we like to do is spend a lot of time evaluating next generation networks. So do a lot of traveling to the various parts of the world to see kind of the latest and greatest. And one of the things I heard today, which, you know, I'm used to it now, I guess, if you will, but people talk about 4G, and they say 4G in the context of what exists today in the U.S. markets. But if you go back to 2004, 2005, when the standards bodies were creating LTE, they didn't call it LTE at the time, and they didn't call it 4G. And what happened is you had the WiMAX forum come out and call WiMAX 4G. That got T-Mobile all up in arms. They started calling HSPA plus 4G. And by that point, everything was 4G. And ultimately, the ITU, which is the official organization which anoints what is 3G, 4G, and 5G, they basically gave in and said, okay, operators, you can call basically anything better than 3G, 4G. And that's what they've done. And so now you can call WiMAX, you can call HSPA plus, you can call LTE 4G, even though in reality 4G is actually LTE advanced, which evolves from LTE. So today, you know, in the U.S. operators are by and large on the original LTE standard, which is technically 3G, although today you can call it 4G, and I won't get too upset. So we lag behind the world. That standard was basically finished in March of 2009. In September of 2011, LTE Advanced, which is the real 4G, was basically finished. So U.S. operators are basically deploying today a technology, you know, by and large, it's a technology that was developed in 2009. They definitely lag behind other operators in the world. I was just in Korea back in August, and they have deployed LTE Advanced. In fact, they deployed it in June of 2013. Now they're basically combining with carrier aggregation, which is one of, I call it the sexy features of LTE Advanced, but allows you to basically logically combine different frequency channels into one logical channel and increase your data rates. And that's very effective when you're dealing with lots of fragmented spectrum. You can basically build a wide channel. So in summary, I would say that in Korea, it's basically an order of magnitude better in terms of performance than
Well,
what we have in the
when
US.
do you expect that to be rolled out here?
LTE Advanced?
Yeah.
It exists in a limited extent, so AT&T has launched it in 1 or 2 markets. T-Mobile has as well. I would expect by some point next year, we'll see it, more deployed. Verizon's focused on trying to shut down CDMA, doing voice over LTE. So there's other things they have to do. But even once they get to LTE Advanced, you're still not going to have anywhere close to what you have in Korea. And that comes down to demographics. I mean, Seoul is the fourth most densely populated city in the world. People have a hungry appetite for mobile broadband. There's a cell tower in every single building. In the US, I think the densest city is Los Angeles, and they rank 80th in the world. So we're never going to get there.
Doesn't it also have to do that in the United States, the channels are much narrower than in many parts of the country, and that's a problem that gets exacerbated by channel aggregation because, for example, Swisscom just launched 300 megabit service because they could glue two 20 by 20 megahertz channels together, where in FDD that's not possible.
Well, no, I'm not quite sure that's true. So in Korea right now, the operators have basically combined a 10 megahertz channel and a 20 megahertz channel. And by early next year, they're going to add a third carrier to get to 40 megahertz. In the US, I'll take Verizon as an example. They've got their C block at 700 megahertz. That's 10 megahertz. They've got a 20 block nationwide AWS. So there's your 30 megahertz channel right there. That's no different than what the Koreans have today. AT&T in some markets, they don't necessarily get there as easily. But technically, I think in a lot of markets, they could get to 15 to 20 megahertz of logically combined spectrum.
What's the impact on battery life?
I actually think it's better. And the reason I say, and it depends on the use case, but by and large with carrier aggregation, the faster you can send the data to the phone, that means the less time the radio is turned on. So it's not just the radio, then if I'm syncing my email, my backlight is on my phone. And my backlight's going to stay on as I'm syncing my email. As soon as that backlight goes off, my battery life is increased dramatically. So things like carrier aggregation, especially in the downlink, all it does is basically send that same amount of data in a much faster amount of time. The sooner you do that, the sooner you turn your radio off, the sooner your backlight goes off. It's hard to say to what extent or what percentage, but I think in most use cases, battery life is actually improved.
And if you're trying to maximize battery life, you want to change the way uplink and downlink are utilized and what bands they're utilized in. If we're trying to uplink or trying to upload over a macro cell that's far away, and you're going to absorb a lot of battery capacity just in that part of the challenge. So I think we're going to start to see other things coming into the picture in terms of capacity. Clearly, the Spark network that Sprint is building with SoftBank's help is going to change that because the size of the channels that are being rolled out and the ability to aggregate them and have them in TDD rather than FDD is going to change the way you can start thinking about how spectrum contributes to the performance of a mobile broadband network. So I think there are going to start to be some other kind of breakthrough innovations, even within the realm of 4G, that starts to reach these performance levels that Michael's talking about. I think the other one that we already heard about is CRAN. And, Cloud RAN would be fantastic if it could find its way into the US market as a technique to separate just in the same way, I think, this is a kind of simplistic view, but in the same way that virtualization is changing the way networks are architected, Cloud RAN will do have the same kind of effect on the transmission side, and we need to find a way to allow baseband pooling to occur efficiently and access to these baseband vaults by having fiber available to them. This is something unique right now to Japan and Korea. They've had a regulatory environment in which these vaults are open to other carriers. They're not dedicated to a single carrier. And I think that if we created that kind of a regulatory environment in which we could have infrastructure available for baseband pooling, that would start changing the way networks are architected.
So a lot of the morning was dedicated to 5G, and there's a lot of confusion around, you know, if that G is actually bigger than the 4G. But, you know, since there's so much confusion, do you think that there will be one rollout, or will it become like feature by feature? Mike, what do you think?
You know, I think going back to my earlier comment about kind of what's 4G and what's not, I mean, the LTE standard continues to evolve. And so I talked about release 10 of the LTE standard. That's LTE advanced. We're now finishing up release 12. And so release 12 introduces all kinds of new and exciting functionality into it that doesn't exist today. That will be finished, let's say, you know, March of next year. And then there's release 13 on top of that. Release 14, which then gets started after release 13, potentially that could be what people will call 5G. And even then, so I think the answer, I guess, is basically 5G is not going to be a standard. It's going to be a series of standards that evolve over time. So maybe in the first instantiation, you know, maybe, you know, the high-end MIMO or maybe the microwave radio, maybe that doesn't make it into the first release, you know, and the standards body say, hey, look, we'd rather focus on machine-to-machine communications and other types of features, and then longer term, we'll introduce, you know, these other features into so-called 5G. And that happens today with 4G. There's ideas that get talked about, sounds great, sounds wonderful, let's talk about it in the next release. And I think the same thing will happen, if history is any guide, you know, with 5G, is that there's lots of great ideas out there for what 5G is. Some of them will get introduced into release 14. Some of them will get delayed into future releases based upon market timing, operator demand, et cetera.
So, again, I think when we heard the history lesson earlier from Docomo, one of the interesting little embedded facts is that there was no such thing as LTE. LTE was a lowercase term called the long-term evolution of 3G. And it wasn't a new technology. It wasn't even, you know, a whole new generation. But in fact, it was the evolution of 3G along certain dimensions. And thinking of that as though there's a sharp break between generations and saying, okay, well, the end of 3G is this, the end of 4G is that, the end of beginning of 5G is this, I think that really is a disservice to the way the wireless industry especially absorbs technology innovation. And I think Michael described releases of LTE, and at some point marketing will take over and somebody will come along and say, okay, well, this is the place at which we can start claiming an order of magnitude difference in performance. And in fact, I'm going to take the first step to say I'm going to be the first to do release 13 and invest in that kind of infrastructure. And at that point, I'm going to say I have the first 5G network. And when I do that, and I start marketing around that, everybody's going to have to chase my tail in order to keep up with that claim. And that's how this is going to happen. This is not just a bunch of policy and standards bodies deciding what is 5G. It's part of the dynamics in the marketplace. And I think similarly, there'll be some other lowercase phrase like LTE that becomes a brand or that becomes a generation of technologies, whether it's NOMA or, OFDMA, which you can't even pronounce. So like it's not a very good term because you can't say it. You got to spell it out. So let's come up with one that we can pronounce and we can give to the CEA, and they can start marketing it and embedding it in their electronics devices so that we now understand what is 5G. That's really, it's got to be a combination of these things.
Here's an example of something. So Verizon had their AWS spectrum, and for a long time they were launching LTE only in 700. Well, 1700 they got 20 megahertz. So now they started rolling that out earlier in the year, XLTE.
XLTE.
It's LTE. It's no different than anything else. But yeah, it is twice the bandwidth. It's also it's twice the data rate. It's because that's twice the spectrum being used. It's not a bad marketing
XLTE
term.
store for a long time. I mean, you don't have to wear XLTE, right?
Not quite sure I understand that one, but yeah.
But
Oh, XLT. Okay, now I'm with you. Okay, it just took me a while. So I'm slow. I'm West Coast, so I'm 3 hours behind.
So does 5G already enter the mind of the investment community?
Not really, no, but we're always late to the game. I feel like I hear things from Peter that I then hear later, 2 years later. No, I mean, where were we? At CTIA, where I saw both of you. Definitely 5G was mentioned in, panels such as this. And that was, I don't remember that last time. You're not having the companies publicly talking about it. They're not part of their talking points. I know that they are in certain labs they all have, but not publicly.
let me give you another way of thinking about 5G. I was in Vegas and I flew here, and in just a matter of 2 days, I was completely overwhelmed by which disruptive change doesn't rely on technology. And when I landed in Vegas, every taxi driver I spoke to talked about how tomorrow I'm going to give them back this cab and I'm joining Uber. And I'm sick and tired of being paid $10 an hour and forced to work 17 hours a day. And I'm giving back this taxi, and I'm going to get my new Camry that they're going to help me finance, and I'm going to be out on the road again tomorrow, and I'm going to get 80% of the fare, and I'm going to give 20% to Uber, and I'm going to be very happy. I'm going to be in nirvana, okay? And I arrived...
thanks to wireless.
Thanks to this. And I'm going to arrive... I've then arrived here, and they're honking their horns and running around town trying to fight Uber from getting into this town. So what I'm trying to say is there's a hidden resource that's available to create capacity. And when we think about networks, communications, we think about transportation, right? Well, you know, there are regulated utilities, there are bus systems, there's the metro. Yeah, sure. But then there are all these cars that are going around town anyway. I mean, when you turn your Uber on, you see how many Uber cars are within a block of where you are, right? And they could be here in 2 minutes. And imagine in Las Vegas, where you can't get anywhere without being in a taxi. All these taxis being given back to the 4 companies that control the taxi monopoly, and all these taxi drivers now being Uber drivers in their own cars, getting 80% of the fares. The economics that this disrupts the market has nothing to do with, well, yes, it does happen to have a little bit to do with technology. I have Uber in my pocket, right? If that wasn't possible, how would I do it? Do I make a phone call? No. I happen to have an application that's very powerful. So what I'm saying is there are ways to restructure and create 5G without having to invent the new technology.
Well, I think the problem is you still need a standard, though.
Absolutely.
And that's a so yes, I think companies will innovate ideas, and there's lots of innovative companies out there, but ultimately, if they want that to become 5G, they take it to the standards body, they introduce it, and people fight over it and become something different. It's a consensus.
We don't have time for that fight. And, you know,
But
the other
with-
example that you gave in a minute ago, and I want to bring it home, is small cells. So in this room, right, there could be 4 small cells by each operator. And they might be in different spectrum bands. We'd have to, if I'm a T-Mobile customer, I have to find a T-Mobile, all that. And that kind of environment where everything is proprietary to an individual carrier makes sense in a macro network, but does it make sense indoors in a small cell environment? Probably not. So when do we achieve something that people have talked about, which is a multi-carrier small cell that's agile and allocates capacity among users and carriers without having to duplicate that 4 times in the same room? I mean, it's hard to imagine people putting that much infrastructure in buildings to support all these different carriers and provide capacity when you don't know how much is going to be used at any point in time. So what we're really saying is, in order for that kind of small cell environment to take hold, indoors especially, we need multi-carrier configurations that can support each of these operators on a common infrastructure.
Great. Well, we're almost out of time, but I think we should open it up to the audience. Perfect. And, if you have, there's a lady in the back. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Linda Moore with Congressional Research Service, and this has been fascinating. Real-world policy is much more interesting. The soft SIM in the iPad is a potentially disruptive technology in the sense that it could enable not just a regular consumer, but also a business to switch networks at will based on what was the appropriate use at the moment. But there's only 4 carriers. So can we change spectrum policy? Are there investment logics behind opening up spectrum licenses along the lines of what's being proposed at 3.6 gigahertz, where we've got smaller area coverages? Can we sell a spectrum license to this business district, for example, so that they can sort out how to do the multi-carrier thing? Because it's in their interest. In other words, how do we get innovation and competition in? How much can we change spectrum policy? Could we sell small cell licenses? Would the financial sector finance that? Those are my questions.
I'll just add on the soft SIM, keep in mind that Verizon isn't part of that, and that AT&T, there is a linchpin in there that I don't know the exact, it's been reported, but you can't switch immediately, or then you have to go to the store and then go back. So they made it a little bit more difficult, so I just had that.
But, yeah, and, there are forces to keep things the way they are, and there are a lot of other things that come around and bite you and change the way things are, inevitably. But let's take what you said. One of the challenges that we're going to face when we try to reallocate above 6 gigahertz spectrum is the geographic dimension. And if I were one of the top 4 operators, I would want large coverage areas, and I wouldn't want to be forced to go down to the small cell coverage area and have to buy coverage in so many places and have to keep paying for it over and over again and over and over again. I would want to be able to buy large blocks and not have, that kind of challenge of buying and creating it like a jigsaw puzzle. But at the same time, I don't necessarily want to get rural coverage if I don't really think it's necessary right now. So I want to be able to come up with a geographic scheme that makes sense economically and logistically. But you're right, if there are a whole different set of players, let's say the real estate industry, as an example, and that industry, or the tower companies, if they intervene and say, hold on, we're a different layer in the network, and in fact, we're trying to allow service providers to become more efficient by not having to put in building coverage themselves. We'll step up, but you have to create a band for us that allows us to operate common networks for multiple carriers and allocate spectrum not to them but to us, and we'll step in here, and in fact we'll go to Wall Street, and in fact we'll probably be able to get REIT status, which gives us a whole different tax structure, and that allows a whole different economic basis for changing to a small cell environment.
Well, if you look at the list of companies bidding on AWS-3, it's full of venture capital firms and designated entities, and even Mario Gabelli is back in the game. And, you know, it's, we'll see if they are here to hold the spectrum and flip it, or if they're here to really, you know, change the world and put their money to build that. You can't force them, you know. If they see the right opportunities, I think they will do what's best for their investors. It's not necessarily up to us to agree with their assumptions. So it will be very, very interesting to see who will win and who will put their money where their mouth is.
Yeah, but the AWS auction doesn't have small licenses.
5 megahertz licenses.
No, no, no.
Yeah, I don't think you,
CMS?
No, there's no CMA.
CMS?
I'm not sure.
It's all the EAs and PAs.
you know, one of the challenges too, when you're buying that spectrum, you know, when it's very fragmented, especially talking about new spectrum, you need basically new hardware, new devices. I mean, there's economies of scale just in terms of a new frequency band, let alone just building a network. So it becomes very economically unattractive to have a very small region where you have spectrum. The other thing I want to add really quickly is you also have something called LTE unlicensed, which basically uses LTE, it puts it in unlicensed spectrum. You know, and that's something that's coming out with Release 13. But basically, you take your Wi-Fi spectrum. Today, it's Wi-Fi only. In the future, that could be LTE. And so that creates an opportunity for somebody else to come into play to introduce a service. Now, starting originally, it's basically like they talked about with the Docomo presentation. You have the control channel on one frequency and the data on the other. It's going to be very similar with LTE and license in that you still need licensed spectrum for the control channel, but all of your data, the bulk of everything you're sending, goes over LTE unlicensed. It's conceivable that in a future release, they make it completely unlicensed spectrum, and both your data and your control channel information goes over unlicensed spectrum. That creates an interesting opportunity for the likes of a Google, for example, to take their dark fiber, take their interest in small cells, and actually do something somewhere.
I think, Carol?
Carolyn Brandon from Georgetown. So I think specifically the question is for Jennifer, but would love to hear each of your thoughts. The question is, as you're looking out, if the FCC just through, for whatever reason, you know, inevitably delays the incentive auction yet again beyond 2016, and we're looking at the AWS-3 as the only near-term spectrum auction, whether and how does that impact some of the CapEx projections that you're looking at? Do companies end up spending less if there is less spectrum coming in, or do they just take the same pot of money and simply, you know, pay it on or use it to spend on infrastructure rather than the raw spectrum?
You know, that's a good question. I think we'll see it. I think you can make a case it actually goes higher because they're spending in the absence of more spectrum. What they've said publicly, no one's given 2015 guidance, but is that Verizon has said they don't see a slowdown in CapEx, and that's for the company, you know, that's done with LTE essentially. And I would expect AT&T, although there's been all sorts of speculation about their spending patterns, to see a similar thing, whereas I would expect wireline component of their CapEx to come down. It's hard to see, as I mentioned earlier, T-Mobile slowing down because I think they're going to have to spend ahead of that growth. And then Sprint has talked publicly about doing 3 to 5 cities to make them Tokyo-like, and their small cells would be a critical component. So I would expect that to go up as well. And you could also, to your same question, make the case that prices in the AWS-3 auction could be there could be more demand in the delay, given the delay of this, the next year's spectrum auction.
I was just going to add, it's very difficult, it's very expensive to do cell splitting. So if you run out of capacity, you got a cell split. If you get the cell site, it's very expensive to build. If you have 10 megahertz of AWS and you pick up another 10 megahertz, increasing your channel bandwidth another 10 megahertz, I mean, that's very efficient in terms of costs. You know, it could be a simple software upgrade. And so, you know, you can look at it, I guess, 2 different ways.
So, Jennifer, I had a question for you. What is refarming going to mean coming forward as CDMA is retired?
I think that's certainly a positive for Verizon and Sprint, and for probably Sprint more so, especially with the old Nextel and the free up of the 800, because they have so much in-network roaming that will go away with that freed up. But I don't know if it's a complete windfall. It's certainly been part of their engineering planning for a long time, so I don't think it's a new.
Well, it's certainly taking longer than
Yes,
anyone predicted.
as I guess everyone-
But you think CDMA, especially in Verizon, is going to be around for the next 2-3 years?
I think it's going to have a very long tail, is my sense. So yes, at least 2 years. The one thing I was just going to make a point, and I meant to earlier, but even in the absence of these spectrum auctions, don't forget the secondary market. And, there's a lot of spectrum, a lot of these deals have been done, but don't forget US Cellular, don't forget Charlie Ergen Spectrum. All of this, with the absence of new spectrum coming to the market, these secondary market transactions become much more prevalent.
And I think we have time for one more question, if anybody has it. Otherwise, we don't want to stand between you and lunch. And thank you very much.